It depends on where you are in the country or where you are in the world. But thank you all so much again. And we had hundreds registered for this. I know people were sending me notes as always, asking about getting the recording. And absolutely, if your friend wasn't able to make it, or if you're only able to stay for part of it, as long as you're registered, you'll get access to this recording. But I'm really honored to get to spend this evening and to just hand over here in just a moment the mic to someone that I worked closely with, but also developed a good relationship with. And it's been great to work with you throughout the years, Michael. And so I'm just going to hand it over to you and let you talk a little bit about your role as chief reader, your history with College Board and advanced placement, getting into this role, and kind of what your job is at the reading before we get into some questions.
Great. Thanks, Brandon. It is a treat to be here and to have an opportunity to talk to so many people who have shared interests in AP English language. So as the introduction indicated, I've been at Florida State for, I guess it's about 18 years now. I've been the director of rhetoric and composition, although I'm stepping down from that position this summer, which oversees our first year composition program. It oversees our, not even oversees it, it interfaces with our reading writing center and digital studio. We have an editing, writing, and media major that I've been able to be a part of. It's a really vibrant major for English majors in our university. And so I was at Clemson before being here, where I was a first-year comp director and worked with a professional communication program. But that's just sort of a long way to say that when I was first asked to work with the College Board and ETS, I was surprised they asked me, because I wasn't, my work was not aligned with standardization and large-scale exams. I do work in writing assessment and digital technologies specifically, but my arguments have been around the idea that we're using technology in the wrong ways in English classes and in writing classes, and that standardization and large-scale testing, I was skeptical of those things. So when I was asked to serve on the development committee, which is where I started, the development committee is the group of about 10 of us that write a lot of the FRQs and look through the passages for multiple choice and so forth. I thought that probably I'd asked the wrong person. And yet I so enjoyed learning about the process. I enjoyed meeting the people. And I very quickly was disabused of my sense that this was an impersonal process. It's very personal. It's very connected. And I was so impressed with the people at every level that I met, both within the institutions of ETS and the College Board, but also all the college and high school teachers that I got to interact with. So when they oftentimes pull in college folks who don't have AP experience, which would have been me. I was developing, the questions and learning about the exam, just as we were working through it. But one of the requirements is to attend the summer reading. And so I started going to the readings, and I started reading at tables with everybody. And then it was both the best and worst week of my year, because there's so much intensity and there's intense learning, but I hadn't practiced my ability to focus that closely for that many hours at a time and just read, paper after paper after paper. And at that time they were papers. This was probably about 13 or 14 years ago. So we had booklets, and we would read through booklets, and it was mind numbing and mind invigorating at the same time. And that's where I really got to meet just so many wonderful teachers and scholars and readers and mentors and friends. And so I've been working with it, I guess, like I said, for 13, 14 years. I've served as a table leader there, a question leader, and I've been an exam leader for the last few years, working very closely with Duku Inoche, who's been a great friend and mentor in the process. So I just started my stint as chief reader on July 1st. So this is really just my first month on the job, although in many ways I've been doing this and training for it for a number of years. So what is it that I do? What is it that we do? What is it that Duku does? There's a lot of different responsibilities, but the primary ones would be to help develop the exams, to help select the questions for the exams, We review the readers, although College Board is starting to take on more of that responsibility. It used to be that the chief reader would review everybody and select everybody for the reading. Just to give you a sense of the scale of our test, as opposed to maybe some of the other tests that are out there, the spreadsheet that they send me of potential readers has about 6,000 people on it. And the columns probably go to double Z or something with all this information. And so they're really good now about helping me sort through that information. So I certainly select the leadership team, who would be question leaders, exam leaders, table leaders, and so forth. But I'm not necessarily involved on the day-to-day selection of readers. However, if reading is something that you'd like to do and you weren't selected or you had questions about that, you can certainly send those to me and I can answer questions about that and maybe even, request for you to be a reader if that's something that you really want to do. And so at the exam, the chief reader oversees the different exams that are going on. We select samples at the beginning of the process, meaning that we find what we think are really clear, like 1-0, or 1-1-0s, 1-2-0, 1-3-0, all the way up through the 1-4-1s. And we annotate some of those for training purposes. We have about 3,000 people who are involved in scoring the 1.8 million responses that we got this year. About a third of them are on site. About 1,000 of us are there on site. And for this year, on site meant Cincinnati. On site next year will mean Cleveland. About 2,000 people are reading and table leading from home. And so the chief reader's responsibilities primarily at that meeting are to make sure every student gets a fair and accurate reading. Almost all the leaders, most of our time, we're doing back reading, table leaders back read readers until we have the confidence that the readers are giving accurate scores. And even then we continue to check and double check the process. I help with, challenging situations, questions, disagreements, really bad handwriting sometimes comes to our office and we have to deal with those, but that won't be going forward as we're shifting over to the digital exam. So it's really about consistency. It's about encouraging people to do their best. It's encouraging people to stay focused. We'll talk about this in a few minutes, but that the idea in a scoring session is not to let each individual bring their own personal views of writing or what they like to see, but we select some very specific targeted things that we look for in the responses and making sure that all the students are getting treated fairly. At the end of the reading, we put our chief reader report together. I think it's one of the best documents that College Board has, and it's probably underutilized, but we write up very detailed notes about every single question and how it performed, all the released questions, how they performed, and it's very, very helpful to see where the score points were gained, where they were lost, and we can get into a lot of details with those. And so we put out the chief reader report. I go to APAC and give a presentation to teachers there. And now we're already starting, we have started already, and we're getting close to wrapping up even, putting the exam together for next year. So the cycle continues year after year, looking at these things. So it's been a real joy to meet the people at the readings on the development committee. And I'll end just by saying that for me, it's sort of a delicate balance between excellence and accountability in the system that we have currently. And so the system that's in place, I advocate for and I encourage and do everything I can to make that the best, most consistent, most fair, fair to the students, fair to the teacher system. And then also, I'm advocating for healthy and sustainable changes that can be made to the future exams. So there's a pilot project going on with a through course writing sample that includes research and revision. We're always talking about how can we train readers better? How can we better get messages out to teachers and AP Central and all these other places? And so I both exist within the current structure and I advocate for that, but then I'm also advocating for changes that could be healthy for us moving forward.
Thank you for that so much, Michael. I appreciate it. And I think it's a pretty healthy overview. You went ahead and brought it up. And so I think we need to mention it because there's lots of rumors that swirl around this pilot project.
Sure.
And what it is and why it's not happening. And,
Right.
I mean, this is something we've been talking about since I was at College Board, and I started in 2014.
Right,
And we're very serious about, we just got to make sure it's done right. So can you
right,
kind of fill some people in on what this is and
sure.
what some of the roadblocks are to it right now?
Yeah. So last summer, not this summer, but we did a pretty large scale pilot project, um, moving toward the day that we hope that we will replace two of the FRQs, synthesis and argument, with a through course process based research paper. And so we'd have a topic, we'd give a few sources, students would find their own sources. They would draft a paper that would be like a synthesis paper, but it would be over time. They could get feedback from the instructor, um, do some revision. And so it's not totally unlike the AP seminar paper where there'll be checks and balances along the way where the teacher would vouch for this being the student's work, because of course, one of the challenges is how do we know in a non-timed setting that students are doing their own work. And so we would do that. We'd likely have to change the scoring guide or get to change the scoring guide so that it would include, right now we're looking at things that really can be done in a short timed first draft, used to be handwritten, pretty soon will be typed, response. And so we did a pilot. There were maybe 20 of us that participated, and we've proven to the College Board that we can score quickly, accurately. They were very pleased with the results of this. And my guess is if it wasn't for the sort of wide scale, I wouldn't say, I was going to say panic, and I don't want to say the word panic, the wide scale concern over AI, I think we would be moving forward much more publicly with that now. So the College Board says they are interested in it. They are moving toward that day. We have to figure out how to mitigate for AI work. And so the goal would still be to work in that direction. It's a pretty major change. And when you're dealing with things on this level, there's over 1 million students who take AP language. There's 600,000 students who take the test. Change isn't going to happen like overnight, and all of a sudden one summer you're going to learn that it's all different. It'll take years, plural perhaps, to roll this out, to provide the right support structures and the training and all the resources that people need. But I am given permission to talk about my own optimism about this. I'm optimistic about it. I think it will mean a lot to the college writing community, in part because a through course revised research paper is going to look a lot more like the kinds of texts that are produced in college composition classes. And where there is criticism of AP language among college faculty, it's often the timed writing environment and the first draft writing that just doesn't necessarily align with the kinds of writing that I grade and see on a daily basis or a semesterly basis. So I think it'll be a difficult change, but I'm advocating strongly for it. I think we can do it well. I think it'll be exciting, but it'll be a lot of work. But that's the kind of work that I'm certainly willing to put in to try to help make that change whenever the College Board gives us the green light on that.